was a rainy afternoon in early March when the old photograph first came to light. In the dim storage room of the county's historical society, dust motes drifted lazily through the slanted beams of sunlight that managed to slip past the warped shutters. Boxes upon boxes of forgotten relics crowded the narrow space, each one labeled in fading ink, its letters curling at the edges of old masking tape. Some contained yellowed letters tied together with string. Others held brittle maps with lines drawn in pencil so faint they seemed to vanish under the eye. It was in one of these boxes, wedged between a stack of tarnished brass buttons and an envelope of train tickets from 1909, that a faded photograph caught the attention of museum archivist Daniel Harrow. He had been sorting through the archives for weeks, cataloging items for an upcoming exhibition on early 20th century rural life. The box itself was unremarkable, simply labeled MISC, 1910s, but as he brushed away the thin film of dust, his eyes fell upon the image of a young girl standing in a sunlit garden. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, her hair neatly tied with a ribbon, her dress crisp and white, the sort of family might save for Sunday in her arms. She clutched a small teddy bear, its fur worn and its button eyes slightly
Subscribe to
uneven
my
at first
channel.
glance. The photograph seemed entirely ordinary, just another portrait from a long-forgotten family album, but something about it made Daniel pause. The girl's expression was different, not unhappy, not frightened, but strangely intent, as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. And behind her, the garden seemed to fade into a shadowed area where the sunlight did not quite reach, even though the rest of the scene was bright. Daniel held the photograph up to the light, studying the details. The print was mounted on a stiff backing, the kind used by photographers in the early 1900s, with a decorative border embossed around the edges. In neat cursive at the bottom was a date, spring 1912. There was no name, no indication of where the photo had been taken. He slipped it into a protective sleeve and made a mental note to scan it later. Hours passed, and the rain continued to drum steadily against the windows. By the time the archives closed for the day, Daniel found himself thinking about the photograph again. Something about the girl's posture, the way she held the bear so tightly, the slight tilt of her head, stuck in his mind. That night, at his small apartment above the bakery on Main Street, he set up his scanning equipment and carefully digitized the image at the highest possible resolution. As the computer processed the scan, the details of the garden came into sharper focus. The lattice of the fence behind her was weathered, but intact. A few flowers, perhaps lilacs, bloomed in the left corner. And yet, there was that shadow again, just behind the girl's right shoulder. It wasn't the shadow of a tree or any other obvious object. It was darker than it should have been, and its edges seemed almost indistinct. Daniel zoomed in further, and the pixels resolved into a blur of darker tones. At that level of magnification, the bear's matted fur and missing stitch at the seam of its leg were visible, as was the faint reflection in the girl's eyes. It was then that Daniel noticed something odd. Her pupils weren't reflecting the garden in front of her, but something else entirely. It was too small to make out, just a vague suggestion of a shape, but it was enough to send a faint shiver along his spine. Over the following days, Daniel shared the scan with two colleagues, Margaret Ellison, a local historian specializing in early photographic methods, and Professor James Rennick, a visiting lecturer from the university with a background in Victorian and Edwardian family portraits. Both agreed that the image was remarkable in its clarity for the period, but Margaret, in particular, was intrigued by the teddy bear. She explained that such toys, while not unheard of, were still relatively uncommon in 1912 outside of wealthier families. The design, she noted, looked similar to the early German bears produced by the Steiff Company, though the ears were slightly different. Daniel wondered if perhaps the bear could be a clue, a way to identify the girl's family. The more he thought about it, the more he became convinced that the photograph had a story to tell. But every time he returned to the high-resolution scan, his eyes were drawn not to the bear, but to that shadowed area in the garden. One evening, unable to shake his curiosity, he enhanced the image again, applying filters to adjust the contrast and exposure. Slowly, the details in the darker portion began to emerge, not all at once, but like shapes surfacing through fog. There appeared to be the outline of another figure, partially obscured by the girl's shoulder. It was faint, almost transparent, and positioned in such a way that it seemed to be standing slightly behind her, turned toward the camera. The proportions were strange. The head seemed tilted at an unnatural angle. Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. It could have been an artifact of the photographic process, a trick of light and shadow. And yet, the longer he looked, the less he was convinced it was nothing. Over the next week, Daniel dove into old census records, church registries, and newspaper archives. The town where the Historical Society was located had been small in 1912, no more than a few hundred residents, so he thought it might be possible to match the photograph to a family name. But despite combing through every record from that spring, there was no mention of a girl matching her description. In fact, there was something stranger still. There were no photographs of children from that year at all in the town's records, as if, for some reason, no families had posed for pictures during that season. Late one night, as the clock ticked past midnight, Daniel decided to run the image through a modern facial recognition program, not to identify her specifically, but to see if any similar facial structures appeared in other historical photo databases. The results were unsettling. The algorithm returned only one match, a grainy photograph from 1938, showing a group of school children standing on the steps of a brick building. One of them, a girl at the far left, bore a striking resemblance to the girl in the 1912 photo, same tilt of the head, same intent expression. The problem was, if they were the same person, she would have been in her 30s in 1938. Yet in the later photo, she appeared to be no older than she had been in the first. Daniel stared at the two images side by side, the hair prickling on the back of his neck. He didn't sleep much that night. Over the coming days, more details began to trouble him. The girl's shoes, for instance, button-up ankle boots, were scuffed in a way that suggested long use, and yet her dress was pristine, almost as though it had never been worn before that moment. The bear's fabric seemed slightly anachronistic for the date, though Margaret insisted such variations were possible in handmade toys. And then there was the background. Daniel began to realize that no matter how much he enhanced it, the plants and fence seemed frozen, without the natural blur of movement one would expect from leaves in a breeze during a long exposure. It was as if the scene had been staged or preserved. The day came when Daniel decided to take the physical photograph out into the daylight again, this time to inspect it under a magnifying glass rather than on a screen. The fine grains of the print revealed even more peculiarities, tiny specks in the shadow that looked almost like eyes, though too small and unfocused to be certain. And there was something else, something he hadn't noticed before. At the very edge of the frame, near the lower corner, there appeared to be a hand. Not the girl's. This one was larger, paler, and positioned as if it were resting lightly on the hem of her dress. But the girl's arms were clearly in front of her, holding the bear, which meant that if it was truly a hand, it belonged to someone else entirely, someone the camera had captured without any record of their presence. That was the moment Daniel knew this was no ordinary photograph, and that whatever story it held had been waiting, silently, for over a century to be told. Daniel didn't go back to the Historical Society right away. For 2 days, he carried the photograph with him in a stiff, protective envelope, almost afraid to leave it unattended. When he set it down, it was always face down, as though the image itself might change if he looked at it for too long. His sleep was restless. He'd wake in the middle of the night with the certainty that someone had been standing in his apartment, only to find the shadows perfectly still. And yet, the unease lingered, like the aftertaste of something metallic. On the third morning, the rain had stopped, and the streets were washed clean. Daniel decided to take the photograph to Margaret again, this time without warning her. He wanted to see her reaction in real time before she could prepare any measured historian's response. Her small office smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper, and she was halfway through sorting a stack of municipal records when he walked in. Without a word, he set the photograph down on her desk and pushed the magnifying glass toward her. "Look in the lower right corner," he said. She glanced at him, curious, then leaned over the print. At first, she didn't react, but as her eyes adjusted and tracked along the hem of the girl's dress, her hand froze on the magnifying glass. "That's odd," she murmured. "You mean this shape?" "Yes. Does it look like a hand to you?" Margaret tilted her head, studying it more closely. "It does," she admitted slowly. "But the skin's lighter than hers, almost as if it's been overexposed. And the fingers, see how long they are? Too long for a child." She set the glass down and looked at him. Could be a double exposure, of course. Not uncommon in those days, if the plate was reused or the photographer didn't advance the film properly. Daniel nodded, though her explanation did little to settle his nerves. "And the figure in the shadows?" he asked. Margaret frowned. "I see. Something. But it's so faint it could be anything." "You're sure you haven't?" He cut her off. "No digital manipulation. That's exactly how it came out of the box." Margaret leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers against the wood. "Well, if you really want to know more, there's one person who might help. Old Mr. Hargrove. He used to collect portraits from around the county, every studio, every photographer. He's practically a walking archive." By that afternoon, Daniel was standing on the creaking porch of a small farmhouse on the edge of town. The door opened slowly to reveal a man well into his 80s, with thin white hair and eyes so sharp they seemed to miss nothing. Hargrove invited him in without question, as though he'd been expecting him. The old man's living room was lined with shelves of albums and boxes, every one neatly labeled in careful handwriting. Daniel placed the photograph on the table between them. Hargrove didn't pick it up immediately. Instead, he stared at it for several seconds, his expression unreadable. "I've seen this before," he said finally. Daniel's pulse quickened. "Where?" "Not the same print. But this girl, she turns up now and then. I've found her in photographs from different towns, different years. Always looks the same age. Always holding that bear." A chill worked its way down Daniel's spine. "How far back?" Hargrove's gaze flicked to the shelves. "The earliest I found is 1894. A street market in Brenton. She's standing in the background, watching the photographer. And then she's in another from 1901, a school group in Milford. And then this one from 1912. Daniel could hardly breathe. "So what are you saying?" "That she, what, doesn't age." "I'm not saying anything," Hargrove replied. "I'm just telling you what I've seen. But there's something else. Every photograph I found her in, something happened in that town not long after." "Something?" Daniel pressed. Hargrove leaned forward. "Disappearances, fires, a drowning. The dates aren't exact, but they're close enough to make you wonder." The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of faded paper and sepia ink. Hargrove showed him half a dozen prints where the girl appeared, always in the periphery, always with that same steady gaze. Sometimes the bear was under her arm, sometimes held close to her chest, but it was always there. By evening, Daniel was driving back into town with the uneasy sense that the photograph in his possession was only one fragment of a much larger puzzle. That night, he laid out the images side by side on his kitchen table, comparing the angle of her jaw, the shape of her hands, the slight curl in her hair. It was uncanny. She hadn't changed in the slightest. It was well past midnight when he heard the sound. A faint, deliberate tapping, 3 knocks, coming from the direction of the table. He froze, listening. It came again, slightly louder. When he turned on the light, there was nothing. The photographs were exactly where he had left them, but the envelope that had held the 1912 print was now empty. The photograph was gone. Daniel stood in the middle of his kitchen, staring at the empty envelope. The light above him flickered faintly, casting an uneven glow across the table. Every other photograph was exactly where he had placed it, but the 1912 print of Clara was gone. He checked the floor, the chairs, the counter, as though it might have simply slid out somehow, but there was no sign of it. A cold prickle ran along his spine. He had locked the door before going to bed. He lived alone. No one should have been able to enter without his knowledge. For several long minutes he remained frozen, listening. The apartment was silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant rush of cars on the wet street outside. Finally, he picked up the magnifying glass, scanning the remaining photographs again, looking for. He didn't even know what. His hands felt unsteady, and the glass trembled slightly with each movement. The image of Clara in his mind was clearer than ever, her large eyes fixed on him with an expression that seemed to contain far more awareness than any child should. He barely slept for the rest of the night. Every creak of the building, every sigh of the wind outside seemed louder, sharper. When morning finally came, pale and gray through the blinds, Daniel went through the apartment again, opening every drawer, every cupboard, every box. The photograph wasn't there. By mid-afternoon, frustration and unease had combined into something close to obsession. He called Margaret. She answered on the second ring, her voice calm, but slightly wary. "Daniel? You sound. What's wrong?" "It's gone," he said. "The photo. The one from 1912. I put it in the envelope, left it on my table last night. When I woke up, it was gone." There was a pause on the line. "Are you certain you didn't misplace it?" "I've checked everywhere. It's not here." Margaret hesitated, then said, "Come to the society. I want to show you something." When Daniel arrived, Margaret led him to the back room, where a large flatbed scanner sat against the wall. On the screen above it was a high-resolution image, his photograph of Clara, magnified far beyond what his own equipment could manage. The girl's face filled the frame. "I stayed late last night after you left," Margaret said quietly. "Something about her expression kept bothering me. So I scanned it again at a higher resolution." She leaned over the keyboard, adjusting the zoom. "Look here," at her eyes. Daniel stepped closer. The pupils were large, dark, and slightly unfocused, as if she were staring past the photographer rather than at the lens. But within the darkness, there was the faintest reflection, a shape that seemed out of place. "It's not the photographer," Margaret said. "The camera would have been positioned lower, and the shape's too narrow. It almost looks like." She trailed off, biting her lip. "Like what?" "Like someone standing behind her, but not in the same room, more like behind her in some other way. I know that doesn't make sense." Daniel stared at the reflection. It was little more than a pale outline, but the longer he looked, the more certain he became that it resembled a figure. Tall, thin, leaning forward slightly. Before he could say anything, Margaret glanced at the clock. "There's another reason I wanted you to come. This morning, the police came by. They said a man had reported someone watching him through his window last night." The description. She hesitated. "It matches what you told me about the shadow in the photograph." Daniel felt the air in the room grow heavier. "Do they think it's connected?" "They didn't say, but they asked if anyone had been going through old photographs recently." "I didn't tell them about you." "Not yet." They spent the next hour combing through the digital scan, adjusting contrast, inverting colors, searching for anything that might explain the strange reflection. But the more they examined it, the less it felt like a photographic artifact, and the more it felt like a moment, frozen, yes, but still somehow alive, as if whatever had been there was aware of being seen. By evening, Daniel left the society with a copy of the scan saved on a flash drive. The streets were quiet, the air damp with the smell of impending rain. As he walked toward his apartment, he kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone following him. But there was no one. That night, he plugged the flash drive into his laptop and opened the image. He zoomed in again, past the grain of the film, past the imperfections in the paper, until Clara's eyes filled the screen entirely. The pale outline in the pupil seemed clearer now, though he knew that was probably just his imagination. He was about to close the file when he noticed something else, something that made his breath catch. In the lower corner of the image, just visible beyond the hem of Clara's dress, was the edge of the teddy bear. And on its fabric paw, in the high-resolution scan, there was a faint mark. It wasn't dirt, and it wasn't damage to the print. It was writing. The letters were small, cramped, and difficult to read, but as Daniel squinted at them, he realized they formed a single word. His own last name. Daniel's hands hovered over the keyboard as the realization sank in. The word on the bear's paw wasn't random. It wasn't an accidental smudge or a trick of the scan. It was his name, his exact surname, written in what looked like dark ink that had faded over the decades. He leaned closer to the screen, his pulse thudding in his ears. The letters weren't quite printed. They were uneven, like someone had written them by hand in a hurried scrawl. He sat back in his chair, staring at the image. How could his name have ended up on a child's toy from 1912? His family had no known connection to the girl in the photograph, no history in that town, no reason for this to exist. The possibility that it was simply a coincidence seemed too slim to accept. Yet the alternative, that there was some deeper link, was unsettling in ways he couldn't quite put into words. The room felt smaller as he closed the laptop, the glow of the screen vanishing and leaving him in a dim haze of streetlight spilling through the blinds. He poured himself a glass of water, trying to focus on the mundane, but the image kept forcing its way back into his mind. The bear's soft paw, the tiny, deliberate letters, his name. By morning, Daniel had convinced himself to track down every scrap of information he could about the photograph. He called Margaret again, his voice tight. "I need to know who owned that bear," he said without preamble. Margaret sighed softly, the sound of papers rustling in the background. "If you want to trace the object, you'll need to find the original photographer's records. That means checking the municipal archives, maybe even the old property registries. It's not going to be easy." "I don't care," Daniel said. "I'll do whatever it takes." The archives were housed in a windowless building at the edge of town, the kind of place where the air smelled faintly of cardboard and dust no matter how often it was cleaned. A clerk with wire-rimmed glasses guided him through the maze of shelves to a back room where boxes were stacked in careful rows. "This section covers 1900 to 1915, the clerk said. "You'll want to look for the Ledford studio records. Most portraits in that period came from there." Daniel spent hours combing through the files, his fingers growing gritty with dust. At last, he found a ledger bearing the Ledford name. Inside, each entry was written in looping cursive, noting the client's name, the date, and brief details about the sitting. Flipping through, he reached April 1912. There it was, Clara Whitcomb, portrait with toy. His heart skipped. Beside the name was an address and a note in parentheses. Special request. Keep negative on file. That was unusual. Most clients took both the print and the plate with them. Why would the studio have been asked to keep this one? He copied the address, then searched the surrounding pages for other Whitcomb entries. There were none. Clara's name appeared only once, as if she had existed solely for that single sitting. By late afternoon, Daniel stood outside the address listed in the ledger. The house was still there, though weathered by time, its paint peeling and shutters hanging askew. The yard was overgrown, the gate leaning at an awkward angle. As he stepped through, he felt the curious sensation of being watched, though the windows were empty and dark. He knocked once, twice. No answer. The third time, the door creaked open slightly, as though the latch had never been properly closed. Against his better judgment, Daniel stepped inside. The air was heavy, scented faintly with mildew and something sweeter, perhaps the lingering perfume of wood long soaked with age. Dust motes drifted lazily in the light from a single cracked window. The living room was empty save for a few warped boards where a carpet might once have been. But there was a staircase to the left, its railing thick with grime. Daniel climbed slowly, each step groaning under his weight. At the top, a narrow hallway stretched out, lined with closed doors. He chose the one at the far end, partly because it was ajar and partly because a strange warmth seemed to seep from the space beyond. Inside, the room was almost bare. Almost. In the center sat a small wooden chair, and on it, a single object. The teddy bear. It was the same size, the same shape as in the photograph, though its fur was patchy and threadbare in places. Daniel approached, his breath shallow. The bear's left paw still bore the faint writing, his name. He reached out, but just before his fingers touched it, a sound came from behind him. A whisper. It was so close that he spun around instinctively, his eyes scanning the empty corners of the room. No one was there, yet the whisper came again, a little louder, and this time it sounded like words, though too faint to make out. Heart pounding, Daniel backed toward the door, but as he did, something changed in the air. The light from the hallway dimmed, replaced by a muted, grayish glow. The room seemed to stretch, its edges growing distant, as if the walls were pulling away. The whisper became clearer. This time, Daniel could make out a name. His own. The bear slid from the chair onto the floor without anyone touching it. The sound of it hitting the wood was sharp and final, breaking the spell for just a moment. Daniel turned and bolted down the hall, down the stairs, and out the front door into the sharp relief of daylight. He didn't stop running until he was back at his apartment. Only then did he realize that he was still clutching something in his hand, a scrap of paper, yellowed with age. He didn't remember picking it up, but the cramped handwriting across it was unmistakable. It was an address, and beneath it, a date. Next week. Daniel sat at his kitchen table long after the sun had dipped below the horizon, the scrap of paper lying in front of him like something poisonous. He had examined it under every light in his apartment, taken photographs, even held it up to a lamp to see if anything was hidden in the fibers. But the words were clear and in plain sight, an address he had never seen before, and a date set exactly 1 week from today. The handwriting was old, no modern pen left strokes like that, and it had a strange quality, almost as though the ink itself had been pulled from the paper by time. The edges were brittle, the paper smelling faintly of smoke and earth, as if it had been buried or stored somewhere damp for decades. And yet, it felt recent in some impossible way, as though it had been waiting for him to find it. Sleep was useless that night. Every time Daniel closed his eyes, he saw Clara's face. Sometimes she was smiling faintly, other times expressionless, but always those wide, watchful eyes locked on him. And in every dream, the bear's paw moved, curling slightly, almost like it was trying to hide the writing. When morning came, he decided he couldn't wait a week. Whatever was at that address, he needed to see it now. The GPS took him far from the town center, out toward the old industrial quarter, where warehouses and rail lines cut through cracked asphalt and weeds. The address led to a narrow street lined with derelict brick buildings, their windows boarded or shattered. Number 146 stood near the end, its facade crumbling, a faded sign above the door reading Davenport Storage and Freight. The front door was locked, but one of the side windows was missing its glass. Daniel hesitated only a moment before climbing through. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the faint scent of rust clung to everything. Rows of wooden crates stood stacked along the walls, many marked with dates from the early 1900s. The light from the window caught on something metallic in the corner, an old weighing scale, the kind used for cargo shipments. As he moved deeper, he noticed something odd, a series of small footprints in the dust. They were too small for an adult, and the pattern was wrong, like the feet had been turned inward, almost pigeon-toed. The trail wound between the crates and led to a door at the far end of the room. The door opened with a groan into a smaller space lined with shelves. Old photographs were pinned haphazardly to the wall, faded portraits, mostly of children, each holding some sort of toy. Dolls, wooden horses, spinning tops, and in the center, a single large print that stopped Daniel cold. It was the same photograph of Clara holding the teddy bear. But in this version, her eyes were different, wider, sharper, and her lips were curved upward in the faintest suggestion of a smile. He moved closer, heart pounding, and saw something else, his own reflection in the glass of the frame. Except it wasn't quite right. The reflection was looking at him, but the angle was wrong, the posture too stiff. And as he stared, the reflection blinked. A sound came from behind him, a soft thud, like fabric dropping to the floor. He spun around. The teddy bear was lying just inside the doorway, its button eyes glinting faintly in the dim light. He hadn't seen it when he entered, and he was certain it hadn't been there before. He took a step toward it, but a sudden chill swept through the room, so cold it made his teeth ache. The photographs on the walls trembled, some curling at the edges. The bear's head tilted slightly to one side, and Daniel realized with sick certainty that it was positioned exactly as it had been in the chair in Clara's house. Then the whisper came again, not faint this time, but close, right behind his ear. "You're late." Daniel froze. The voice was high, childlike, but carried a weight that made his stomach knot. He turned slowly, but the room was empty. The bear lay where it had fallen. On the floor beside it was another scrap of paper. This one was newer, the ink still sharp. It bore the same handwriting as the first note, but with only 3 words: "Don't change it." He didn't know what it meant, but his hand shook as he picked it up. The moment he touched it, the lights in the room, though he was certain there had been none, flickered. A low rumble rose from somewhere beneath the building, the vibration traveling through the floor into his bones. Then, just as suddenly, silence. Daniel stuffed the note into his pocket and back toward the door, eyes fixed on the bear. But before he could leave, something in the corner of his vision made him stop. One of the other photographs, a boy holding a toy train, was different now. The boy's face was turned toward Daniel, and on the side of the train, written in the same cramped script as before, was the date from the first note. The one said, "For next week." And beneath it, in smaller letters, a message that made Daniel's breath catch. "Bring her." Daniel didn't move for a long time after reading those 2 words. "Bring her." His mind looped over the phrase again and again, as though some part of him thought it might change meaning with repetition. But it didn't. It was as plain and sharp as a command could be. The first thought that came to him was absurd. Clara was long dead, a face captured in a photograph more than a century ago. How could he bring her anywhere? But the longer he stood in that cold warehouse, staring at the altered photograph of the boy with the train, the less absurd it seemed. The rules that governed this thing, Whatever it was, were not the rules of the normal world. He stepped backward, his hand tightening in his jacket pocket around the first scrap of paper. He felt the ridges of the old ink through the fibers and realized with a start that the paper was warmer than it had been before, almost pulsing as though responding to the words he'd just read on the photograph. Outside, the sky had gone a strange, muted color, neither the blue of day nor the deep gray of evening. It was as if the light itself had been thinned, like watered paint, and the shadows on the street seemed to stretch just a little too far toward him. He didn't remember walking to his car, only the sensation of his fingers gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual as he drove away. Back in his apartment, he laid both notes on the table and stared at them. The dates, the handwriting, the deliberate vagueness, it all pointed toward one truth he had been trying not to face. Someone or something was orchestrating this. The girl in the photograph wasn't just a relic of the past. She was connected to the present in ways that made no sense, and if the notes were to be believed, she was still out there. Margaret was the only person who might help him make sense of it. He called her again, but this time there was no answer. He tried twice more before deciding to drive to her house. It was dark by the time he arrived, and the front gate hung open. The porch light was off, though Daniel could see a faint glow from somewhere deeper inside. He knocked once, twice, then tried the door. It was unlocked. The inside smelled faintly of old paper and something acrid, like burnt hair. "Margaret," he called, his voice too loud in the stillness. No answer. He followed the light, which led him to her study. Her desk was covered in photographs, some he recognized from the archives, others entirely new to him. At the center of the desk was the same portrait of Clara holding the teddy bear, but in this print, the bear was gone. Clara's arms were empty, her hands clasped together at her waist. Daniel stepped closer, his breath catching. In the lower right-hand corner of the photograph, where a signature or studio mark might be, someone had scrawled in faint pencil, "She's not yours yet." The words made his skin crawl. He turned to leave, intending to call out for Margaret one more time, but froze when he saw movement in the hallway. A small figure, standing utterly still, head tilted just enough to catch the light. It was Clara. She was exactly as she appeared in the photograph, the same white dress, the same long hair, but there was something sharper about her now. Her eyes locked on his, and she smiled just barely, as if amused by his reaction. Daniel couldn't speak. The air felt heavy in his chest, and each second stretched longer than it should. Clara didn't move closer, but the shadows around her seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. "You came," she said softly, though her lips never moved. Daniel blinked, and she was gone. The hallway was empty. On the floor where she had stood lay another scrap of paper. This one was torn along one edge, as though ripped from a larger sheet. It bore only the date from the original note and an arrow pointing downward. He looked around, then down at the floorboards. In the narrow gap between two planks was the edge of something metallic. He pried it free, a small brass key, cold to the touch. Attached was a tag with a number, 146, the warehouse address. Daniel left the house without looking for Margaret. The drive back to the industrial quarter felt shorter this time, though he couldn't remember most of it. When he reached number 146, the street was darker than before, the shadows deeper. He unlocked the front door with the key and stepped inside. The bear was waiting for him in the center of the floor. This time, its head was tilted the other way, and in its lap lay a folded piece of paper. When he opened it, he saw a single sentence, "Next week, she walks." Before he could react, the sound of small footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. He turned toward the sound, and in the far corner, just visible in the dim light, was Clara. Only this time, She wasn't holding the bear. She was holding his hand.